Okay, this lesson concerns what you all are actually in the aggregate feedback, giving back. That is, in feedback, you're communicating what fits a very large category of psychological ploy manipulation that fits under what I've taught three different times where I pastor, namely talk versus text. Now, talkers, there's more talkers than texters. So, Jesus said, you've heard it said, and then he would demonstrate the error of what men said, that is, the commandments of men that they would substitute for or the traditions of men that they would place above and supplant the commandments of God. So he was always contrasting that which is written with what men were saying. And that's what you'll always contend with. You just need to understand. Now, when you understand it, you won't suffer those side effects because some of you, when you study the language and you come to understand what the text says, as people say, I think that's a wonderful saying when people say, when we understand the text. Okay, so let's see what that means. Usually it's people are talking about the talk because we call talk the text so often. Well, it's actually called gaslighting. I only encountered it because of work in Jay Adams' Competent Counsel. I've been studying counseling for years, and I'm actually a student at Louisiana Baptist University, and I've done a lot of work so far in their PhD program on nouthetic counseling. Now, I've certainly somewhere in there finished a master's degree, a Master of Science in Human Performance Improvement Technology, which somewhat distilled and, if you will, focused on things 30 years later after a lot of the abstractions in psychology and the theories in organizational management and behaviors had been tested and meta-analysis had been performed. And a lot of those things more or less just fell out. So I was very fortunate to study as late as 2015 in that graduate program and learn more as far as the feedback and data says. But in nouthetic counseling, one thing Jay Adams does is talk about the fatal question of why. And he gave an example of Eli asking his sons why. He calls it that fatal word. He said we shouldn't ask why. We should focus on what. He said what leads to solutions to problems. So, and interesting enough, he's a Calvinist, and that's enough said there. But now he didn't practice the abstract questions that lead to futility, especially if you're a believer. Let's say you trusted Jesus for everlasting life. You read the Gospels, for example, and you noticed where he indicted the religious people and told them, well, you're searching the scriptures. He said, for in them you are supposing that you are having everlasting life, but they are they which point to me, but you have no interest in me. So shrouding one's unbelief in Jesus by preoccupations with anything but the truth that Jesus taught. And John the Baptist said in John, I think, chapter 3:36, that everyone who's already believing in the Son is already having everlasting life. He said, but those who are disallowing themselves to be persuaded, deliberately, willfully causing themselves to refuse man's causal, by the way, we'll get to that in a moment, to refuse to be persuaded, which is a very interesting word there. The wrath of God's abiding on them already. So they're already in are remaining in an aggravated situation. They are definitely, but there's really no minced words there. Even the purpose of the Gospels, the scripted miracles within their contextualized narratives have been written and remain on record so that, or in order that, those who read or hear it might deliberately cause themselves to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And then as ones who are believers, ones who are always believing, that's a participle, they might have life through his name. Now, 1 John 5:1 shows that the person represented by the participle, a gerundive noun, a verbal substantive, we would say in grammar terms, for those of you in this class, we notice that the antecedent action, they were fathered out from God. Well, of course, those fathered through the gospel will be ones who are always believing. Now, that's a problem we've learned for the Arminian construct. not for us. We support the Bible. We don't use the Bible to support Arminianism, Calvinism, Lutheranism, or Molinism. The Bible is the only infallible source material we have. The rest is fallible. We evaluate, define, document, disclose the disparities between the two. But if you read the Gospels and you notice that Jesus said the one who believes has everlasting life, and you know the appeal there is faith in Christ and faith alone, that's one of the assertions within Christianity, especially knowing the faithfulness of Christ alone is that source out from which a person who believes in him is declared right. So we have the gospel of justification in Galatians. We have the good news, the correct message, I should say. There's a correct message in Galatians about our standing before God. Within the Gospels, the famous parable of the Pharisee and the publican. The publican did not lift so much his eyes to heaven, kept his head down, smote upon his chest, saying, Father, God be merciful, that is, he said. Merciful, conciliate yourself, provide a base of satisfaction with reference to yourself. For me, the sinner, he acknowledged himself as a sinner. So he didn't enumerate his sins, as people would say. He did mind after the message. He saw that message there, and he knew that those temple lambs were God's provision. So he asked God to provide for him. And Jesus said that man, the publican, went down to his house as one who, having been justified, was always being justified. So I said all that to say that if you read the gospel and you trusted Jesus for everlasting life, why now are you, as the signs of, some of them I noted here, of this thing called gaslighting? And I'll try to find articles on this because I've studied so much psychology to get all this jargon, and then the Master of Science in Human Performance Improvement Technology at Grantham University. It's a composite of organizational behavior, psychology, industrial psychology. It's actually the education for a consultant. So I use that to have the vocabulary and the jargon. But appealing back to Jay Adams, why don't we focus on what for a minute? Well, we will, but why are you distrusting yourself? Why are you going back to when you trusted Jesus? Like some people have gone back, second guessed themselves. And I asked them, as a great scholar in our seminary, Dr. John Owen, pointed to the Gospel of John. He even told us take Gospels of John and use them for our outreach material. And we did. We've used thousands of those and distributed them because he says, if you believe what this says, then you have what it says, which is everlasting life. Now, who are these people causing us to distrust the one who told us? Because it was Jesus, the one in whom the fullness of Godhead dwells bodily, who said that. So we're going to look at how we're led to be to distrust our own memories, recollections, when we trusted Jesus, and well, did I really trust him? Was I straining when I did it? We can also feel a sense of being intimidated. Now, I don't experience this personally, but it's because I've been working in under a lot of pressure and distressors, if you will, but on behalf of others for years. And whether it be in industry, whether it be in different manufacturing environments or retail or sales or anything like that, I've always worked. And then I've consulted and counseled and on behalf of the dear souls being victimized. I find all these people that were just, they trust Jesus. They know they have everlasting life. They came out. They were baptized into Christ. That is the assembly there. Paul differentiates the person of Jesus the Christ and the assembly in the church letters. Very carefully does that. He does an excellent job. And they are there and they're fellowshipped into the gospel, and they are in that common union, and yet it's just not enough. And even they self-examine, self-correct, present their families to the Lord's table at the Lord's Supper and acknowledge his headship. And yet we have encroachers come and gaslight our congregation. And I'll deal with that another time. But what is this? So let's just look at it. And how am I immunized to it? Well, we just use the text. So back to what we were saying earlier, pistuo, those of you in this class can do this very easily now, and you can help a lot of people. That's G4100, pistuo. Then there's pisteo, G569. Now this really helps when you can just cite the number, because for people who don't use the Greek, they just won't accept things. They'll tell you that you can lose your salvation or that you have to keep your salvation, and you'll tell them But the Bible says, I'm one who, having been kept, am always being kept. You can tell them Jesus said you'd never die, never thirst, never hunger, never be plucked out of his hand, and you would never self-destruct. To use middle voice, his sheep would never self-destruct. That is, as a result of his own actions, stop being his sheep. So there is no one. The sheep can't destroy his sheep because he won't, Jesus said, will absolutely not destroy himself. He'll always be his sheep. And he said that the wolf would never pluck him out of his hand. He said that his sheep would never die, even if we die. So, but they'll question that. And you'll be like, now, how much more would Jesus have to say for us to notice the difference between the good shepherd and the hireling? So no matter what you say, these talkers, there's always more talkers. They are not interested in the text. They refuse to be persuaded. They will not trust Jesus Christ for everlasting life. They take everlasting life like the manipulators there are out there. Remember, just the carrot on the stick. And here you are, and you've got these hurdles here. Let's say you've got this one hurdle here, and let's say it's Calvinism. You got to go through that gauntlet. Or here's this other one, and it's Arminianism. And here you are with this next one here, all these versions of Lutheranism. And then you've got this, whatever this is, Molinism. And, you know, you got to go through here. And like I said, I'm a Cherokee, actually, and I often laugh about it, saying you can follow Jesus without following a white guy, because these three are the dominant constructs out there. But anyone that places this between you, there's only one thing between that reconcile God and man. That's the cross. So here's, let's say that's the throne of God. And we were taught this as children. So if you don't know the gospel and you've been taught to question, this is what I can show you here. That debate about regeneration precedes faith or not, that yes or no, cause you to question, and people are really exasperated about, well, we don't have any form of regeneration prior to the finite verb. So we've learned that the entirety of this argument, or this false dilemma, if you will, is because people fail to notice the difference between a finite verb and a participle. Remember, the participle is a word that participates with the finite verb adjectively, or not adjectively, but adverbally with the finite verb, and they can function as adjectives, and they are gerundive nouns and verbal substantives and all these other elaborate ways. But to notice that nowhere in the Bible do we have genao preceding the finite verb. So there's genao. And you say, well, that was easy. Well, if you're being gaslit and you don't know the languages, and you don't know that people are out recruiting, trying to get you, there's all these people between here and there recruiting you. Remember, it's called proselyte. It's our word recruit. They want to have you approach toward them, come toward them, literally come toward them, the word says, and even come toward an advantage for them, which Paul said about the Galatian churches. He said to those dear people there, he said that these people are seeking you zealously, but not for your good, rather for a show in their flesh. They had no interest in the law, the integrity of the law, the benefit of the law of Moses and its purpose of being a schoolmaster. Paul had to iterate that to the Galatians because these people had not come in teaching anything like that. So all of a sudden we notice that this dilemma over here is the embarrassing difficulties quickly dispelled. Well, you come over here and you remember we'll be asked about sovereign or free will. And we'll be told that, well, if man has free will, God's not sovereign, or God's sovereign, man doesn't have free will. And by the time you get trying to compose yourself, someone's then brought in libertarian. They'll accuse you of that, and you're like, well, I don't know what that is. And then they'll say, well, you should be a compatibilist or whatever that is. And then who knows what else? I'll just write ditto sub 3, because whatever form it is, it's really just another conversation. But what have we learned in our holistic hermeneutics is define your terms. So if you define free will, let's say we define church from ek Ecclesia, called out, out from, called, or invited out. That would be a guest. So we define baptize as immerse and or submerge. Some people translate that way. So we know how to define a word from the Bible. So if we translate this define it, causal being, agency. I had the funniest thing, a religious person, he didn't mean it. I don't blame him. He's primed. And he said something about when I mentioned something he was reading, I had mentioned what he called human agency. So class, what do you think I said? Well, I asked him, I said, so you're saying the antecedent to the pronoun where it says, I know in whom I have believed is not a human, not a person. But I use human because he said as soon as I introduced human agency, he was done. And I was just really struck that he had gone into that ethereal realm where he was so detached from the text and any definitions of the word. So we know that on this side over here, we have the gospel. You can read that in Gospel of John. You have the gospel, and it's always first. So it's first place, and it should be. The Father only wants it to be about His Son, and the gospel is only about Jesus. Then we have believe, the finite verb. Oh, misspelled it. Believe, finite verb. And then we have fathered through the gospel. So here we're fathered through the gospel. There we go. Fathered through the gospel. That's 1 Corinthians 4:15, Paul said. And then you can go look at John 20:31. Okay, so fathered through the gospel. Also, we're fellowshipped. We fellowship. Our fellowship is into, you can look this up in Philippians, into the gospel. Isn't this something how all this just, all gospel. So that really answers all this for us, and nothing will take the position of the gospel. There is nothing, even in Galatians 2:16, the causal relation in that participial, the perfect active participial from ado, which is adotes. Those of you that are using your language, you can handle this very easily. It was, Paul said that as ones who having known or continuing to know, always knowing that no kind of man is justified out from any kind of works of any kind of law, except through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, a very unique, he said, through Jesus Christ's faithfulness. That's the only kind there is, the Jesus Christ faithfulness kind. He said, even we ourselves, then he said, even we ourselves believed, simple form of action, into Jesus Christ, or that we might be justified out from His faithfulness. So why are people who trust Jesus for everlasting life being gaslighted? Why, when we say faith alone and we don't add some future, like Dr. Charles Spurgeon, who was a supporter of Calvinism, who went so far as to say Calvinism is the gospel. Later, he was explaining what the gospel is, and he said it's a faith in Christ eternally. It's to trust Jesus for everything in that moment. It's not a Jesus trust Him plus some future performance. He said that's not the gospel. So even as a person known to support Calvinism, he did not tamper with faith alone. He wanted people to know that unless you trust Him wholly, which how else would we want to trust? We prefer to trust only Jesus for everlasting life. We don't need the obstacle course, and these things didn't even begin until 1517, October 31st. You can look all that up. That's when the Reformation started. These were Catholic priests, I believe. You might go look all that up. But here, let's go back over here. Now you're being gaslit. You're being asked a false dichotomy. You just defined this free will as causal agency. So man's causal. But you can go ahead and strengthen your argument, because you can then say that you can write in here believe. And that's from our G4100. Remember, you're being gaslit. These people have no data. They just talk. You have G569, go slow because they don't know this either, and that is disbelieve. And then remember, cross-reference John 3:36, where John the Baptist preacher said that there were those who were deliberately causing themselves deliberately refusing to be persuaded. So that's deliberate, it's causal, it's willful. Heard a great Calvinist, Dr. Steve Brown of Key Life. I know a lot of people find him spurious and scandalous and whatever, and I don't think he cares, but he was saying to an audience when he was preaching, because he says he supports all 5 points of Calvinism and he's Orthodox and he knows all this, but then he goes ahead and preaches the gospel, which is really, really interesting if you ever hear him. But he was saying that whether you believe today or disbelieve, that's deliberate and that's willful. That's on you. So he was saying what this says. So you'll either believe or disbelieve. Now, this is very binary now. You've got this all worked out. Binary. It's you will believe or disbelieve. And this is all a deliberate causal action. Well, now here's what really brings you out of the gaslight here. Ado. This is where we get our word idea in English, and then video in Latin. And it's an insight word. And like I said, this is where we get what we know is you hear these big topics of awareness or consciousness. As I like to tell one guy who's trying to gaslight me, I said, well, you had a good point until you made it. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, now that we all know the same thing, it's a little impossible now to call into question my sanity and what did I do. The question is, as Jay Adams would say, is what did you do? Did you believe, cause yourself to believe, or did you cause yourself to disbelieve? And this is where the gaslighting just goes away. It's interesting, too, because I know there's some advocates of the doctrine, let's say, of election, as people have taken it out of the Bible and made it an instrument in a forensic rather than the faith once delivered. But they'll tell you about all these elaborate things about election. They'll say they believe it. They say it's the differentiator or whatever. Let's just say A, B, C. They'll say A, B, C, D, whatever. But then what's really strange is at the end of it, they'll say, but I don't know, or I can't know if they are elect. Are elect. So to give it to you in some of, the fellow knocks on the door and tells me he is an expert in plumbing. He has information about it and all this. And I said, were you a plumber? He said, no. So I didn't have to call another person because what I need is a plumber, someone that can do something about it. But when you hear someone that just gets into this abstract concept and they want to call you into question, this is called gaslighting. They want you to doubt yourself, and you may even be intimidated by them. Some of the symptoms include triggered discomfort, like, oh no, here comes the person with the questions I could never answer. Well, then it's a bad question. The only question an evangelist will ask, a soul winner asks, is have you trusted Jesus Christ for everlasting life? Simple form of action. An evangelist, a person reaching out to win souls, to reach someone with the good news of what Jesus accomplished and what God did through Jesus Christ and revealed his love for us in Jesus Christ. Because the question is not, does God love us? It's, men, do you trust him? Do you love him? Do you obey and understand the imperative when Jesus said trust him? Because that imperative was good news, because he was saying, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. And he spoke and indicted the religious establishment as a way of death, as a broad way that leads to destruction, as a way of futility, as a way that would not give you rest, as a way that would end your life, that would enslave you. He called us and gave us good news that we could trust him. So with all this being said, this awareness, this when you're conscious of all this, how can you be gaslit? Because I don't know who would know any more than we know here. So if someone comes in here and saying, hey, trust me, I want to tell you about my understanding. Well, you moved election between somewhere in here. You've now made the question not what did you do? Did you trust Jesus for everlasting life or not? Because if that's true and you have everlasting life before you ever even get involved in this, then this will start devaluing quickly. But why are we being gaslit? Well, it's because we obeyed Jesus. We trusted him. We heard the good news that all those who trust him only trust, not I didn't say, well, I trust Jesus for everlasting life, plus I hope I'll be good enough according to whatever hoops and hurdles are lie before me. And listen, people will give you plenty of hoops. They'll always change in diameter. They'll always change in how high they hold them up. They'll have hurdles that are always moving. The distance between them is always farther. The hurdles are never the same. You'll never jump the same hurdle twice. And whoever's running the hurdle and hoop factory, they're really merchandising men. So you're just being gaslit, though, and you can go to Soteriology 101 or go to faithalone.org, and you'll see people who give you the clarity of faith alone. At one time, like I said, even Calvinists wouldn't dare tamper with the moment a person trusts Jesus Christ for everlasting life. And this has gotten so fuzzy that it's as simple, though, as define your term. So go to your historical holistic hermeneutic. We have a PDF online. You can go to the books tab, and you'll notice that this was simple as just define the term. And so while you're over here being asked about these very well developed, very lengthy, and it seems like it's just the conversation just keeps, it's called accretion. And we also, when we do projects, we notice people creep away. So this thing's become so layered in time, but now it's called project creep. We're getting so far away from the what, as Jay Adams warned us in Nouthetic Counseling literature, if you've ever read it. Let's get back to what for a moment. What for a moment. Okay, so what did you do when you heard that good news that those who trust Jesus for everlasting life have everlasting life? Did you deliberately cause yourself to believe what Jesus said? Or are you someone who has deliberately caused yourself to disbelieve? Now that we get the what out the way, then the imperative has been communicated. And there's no game first. And even when we read in the churches there in the letter to Galatians, those churches in Galatians, in the letter they're called Galatians, we notice that these people had already heard the gospel. They'd already trusted Jesus for everlasting life. They were already gathered as covenant communities, assemblies. They were there in that southern region of Galatia. And these people came in and encroached upon them. So the question is not, are you saved or not first? The question is that the gospel? Is that the good news that Jesus preached, that those who trust him have everlasting life? Is that the good news that John the Baptist taught, that he said those who are already believing into the Son are already having everlasting life? Is that message that John the Baptist preacher said when he said, made it so painfully clear? Then he said, but those who are deliberately causing themselves and refusing themselves, causally refusing themselves to be persuaded. I mean, I don't know how much more plain it can be, but soul winning is a joy if you know what you're doing and if you're not preaching the good news. But if you want to get caught up in all this, and sometimes you may mistake it. You'll think the person's meaning well for you. And then you'll find out you're in their web, and instead of you going out preaching Jesus Christ, the good news about him and about his faithfulness unto death, even the death of the cross, about him fulfilling the law, fulfilling all righteousness, his faithfulness being the definition of righteousness of God, you'll be out asking riddles and playing games with people. And you won't even notice that while you're enjoying it is really the sick question. And I'll ask that one. You're enjoying it because you're watching people suffer and angst over something from which you won't relieve them. These advocates of fallible constructs will relieve you when you finally go along with them. The recruitment process is over because you've yielded and come along and taken the truth to use it to support fallible constructs. But I'm here to tell you the good news, and any believer, gospel believer who teaches faith alone, like faithalone.org, faithalone.com, a faith blog. Someone just subscribed to our outreach today from Faith Blog. They know that the relief that God offers us is when we trust what Jesus said, because we don't have recurring angst and the futility. Remember, Jesus said, "Come unto me if you need rest, and I'll give you rest." The word pause. Religion is futile. Everything in the kingdom of God is utile. It's utility. It's good for us. It has a benefit. We don't diminish. We're like the 23rd Psalm says. We are sheep that don't want lack depreciate, because we are being sheep herded by the great God of the Bible. So you have a blessed day, and this is how you deal with being gaslighted. And I'd rather be one that practices spotlighting, and let's just put some light on. So have a blessed day.